Oh buddy, Andy here again with my last video, which I think was called The Choice, all about the sort of punk era, and a conversation I was having, or one of several conversations that I was having with a local friend of mine about the same sort of age. Watch the video, I'll put a link to it down there, but in there I happened to mention other aspects of the sort of punk era about that time, you know, when music changed and we had supposedly to make a choice. But one of the things that's happened then, and I suppose for those people who are even older, some of this did actually start back in the 60s, as I said in the last video about, you know, the history of rock music, or popular music if you want to put it that way. It's only been about 20 years since the advent of the rock and roll era up to the punk era of 76, 77 and beyond. But in the 60s obviously we had the Summer of Love and we had that sort of revolution that went on, but I always felt that that was a little bit of a US centric thing, not completely obviously, because the ripples of that came across to the UK and everywhere else pretty much across the world, and we certainly felt it over here in the UK. I might have been a bit young to remember some of it, but you know that it happened and it did open things up. But out of that the music changed, and then obviously, as I said, in the 1977, the sort of punk era and everything, the music rebelled against that, if you want. But it also brought, as I suggested in that last video, a whole new way of thinking. It sort of tore down the walls and it ripped up the rule books and it challenged authority, and it also brought about what you could call that sort of do-it-yourself culture, because the way that things had been done before, even in the 60s I think, and even through the Summer of Love and all that type of thing, things were still pretty staid, they were still pretty boring, especially over here in the UK. The establishment was still pretty much what it was, and the media and the BBC and all that type of thing, everything, magazines, music, generally, it was still pretty much the same sort of thing. But when the punk era came along, because it was different and no one really wanted to touch it because of the, you know, the Sex Pistols and the Bill Grundy stuff and all the swearing, the filth and the fury as they called it at the time, there weren't that many avenues, and we saw it with the Sex Pistols themselves, first being on EMI, then being on A&M for a very short period of time, and then it was only someone like Richard Branson, who I suppose came out of the sort of the hippie-ish era a few years before and had a different way of thinking, that the Sex Pistols were able to release an album. Other bands did get onto some of the other labels, maybe the more forward-thinking labels, or jumping on the bandwagon types of labels, but so many other people couldn't do it, so they had to do it themselves, and that is still being felt now, and that's hard to believe. And something we were talking about, myself and my friend, the other day actually, and I don't think that many people realise just how much effect that particular period had. As I said, there may be cases for some of it going back a bit further, but I certainly think that really changed things up, really shook things up. It changed the way that so much media, apart from music, everybody's starting up their own record labels, Stiff Records, Rough Trade Records, you know, and all the others that came about, Beggars Banquet, and you know, there's loads of them, you can probably name some yourself, that came out at that time. Some of those are still going, some of them have been swallowed up, some of them have fallen by the wayside. But they started something, and they encouraged other people to say, well, okay, it's not easy to do this, but okay, we'll just do it ourselves. And if there's a block, you know, there's a roadblock in the road, well, we're going to go down this avenue, we're going to try something a little bit different, we're going to do it differently and shake it up. And other people are doing things now because of the way that was done. One thing that Rough Trade did, and one of the things that came out with all these people trying to release their own singles and their own albums or their own material, whatever you want to call it at the time, was there's no way of distributing this, and Rough Trade Records set up their own distribution network so that they could set out all of these singles and everything around the country and send them out. And they started that whole thing for the independent record labels. It hadn't been done before. Once again, there's a block in the road, well, we're going to overcome this, we're going to do it our own way. In the magazine publishing and everything, that all the fanzines and everything that came out of that shook up the way that things are done. So many magazines that are around now either came out of that particular era, or certainly some of the ideas that felt that, well, actually we could have a go at this ourselves. People just didn't think at that time, it's, you know, that they could do it. It's hard to remember, but we were saying once again in the conversation that if you look back to those times, if you were alive during those times, and maybe you weren't, or maybe you were too young to realise what was going on, it was a completely different era. You know, there was, you know, the strikes all the time, 3-day weeks, and you know, power going off, that type of thing, especially in the run up to the punk era. But we remember the rubbish in the streets in Leicester Square and all that sort of stuff in the late 70s, and the government as it was, and the government changing in 79, which shook things up again. But it was a really different time. Now we live in a completely different age, and everything, or so much of what we have now, can be traced back to some of those things that happened. We were talking about particular magazine publishers that started off back in the sort of punk era, who moved through, started up their own magazines, and now moved onto the internet. Designers, fashion, all that stuff, photography, people came out of all that. The graphic designers or whatever came out of that particular era and were given an opportunity, were given a chance, which they took, which they wouldn't have had before, because they thought, well, I can do this, I can do something differently. It gave a whole new way of thinking, as did the 1960s as well. And I suppose if you think about it, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but if you look at the way that the internet has changed it, the internet is very much a do-it-yourself culture. Doing this type of thing, if you think about the way that YouTube, which you're probably viewing this on, came about, because 2 or 3 guys in America thought, well, there isn't really a way, there isn't a site that we can put our own videos up. You know, they just wanted to put, I think their first video was at the zoo of an elephant or something like that. They put that up there and they thought, well, actually, this isn't too hard, is it? I've personally just been building a website for a project which I shall talk about, which is very much a do-it-yourself project as well. And you know, I still have that sort of ethos from being around as a teenager in the punk era. That still sticks with me, as it did with my friend. And we were saying, it's amazing how these things come back and you suddenly think, well, actually this all comes from that sort of time, which is I'm on about. But this particular process is very much a do-it-yourself process, and I've been basically designing my own website because I'm using something called WordPress, which I suppose is a free service out there on the internet, would never have been there before. Someone probably created that because they didn't want to pay someone to do something for them. They could do it themselves. Let's do it ourselves. Let's do it yourself. Get it out there and enable you to do something that maybe you've had an inkling of doing for a long time, but you've never had the balls, the guts, the know-how, all the confidence maybe to get out there and actually give it a go and think, well, actually I'm going to do this myself. I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to do it myself. And that's that whole ethos. It's still here now, sort of 35 years later, after the punk era. And as I said, you can put this across everything. The internet is a great thing for that. And in fact, if you think about it, that's what people like Bill Gates and, you know, and Paul Allen and Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, etc., did back in the day. You had all the big corporations building either software or computers themselves, and they thought, well, actually, we're going to do this ourselves. You know, we're going to get the components and we're going to build our own computers. We're going to write our own software. That's the do-it-yourself mentality. As I said, it cuts across so many different ways. If it hadn't been for those people from the 60s or from the 70s ripping up the rule book and saying, well, actually, we're going to go down this avenue, not that one, we might not be here today. You know. Think about that one and discuss it, if you will. So for me, that whole thing is still there, the rebellious spirit, I suppose, in as much as that, okay, sod it, I'm going to have a go at doing this myself. You might, you know, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. And I've got the opportunity to do it now because of sites like this, of the internet and everything else. All those things that go back all those time to the 60s, but certainly to the late 1970s. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and whether it's affected you in one way, either back then, right now, or in the future. You've been inspired to do things because of other people that have done them and showed you that maybe you could have a go at this yourself. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks for your time. I'll speak to you again soon. Goodbye. Very quick postscript. I just looked because I did jot some things down. There's something I wanted to mention, actually, one of those other things that people might not realise that came up because of the advent of all the small record labels and that came around at the punk era. It changed music, but not just for rock music, not just for punk music. It enabled other genres of music to change as well. If you look at bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard and all those bands that came out of that particular time, what they called the new wave of British heavy metal, they all started because of the punk attitude that started before that. And I know bands like Iron Maiden would certainly tell you that now, that they came about because of that, and other bands were inspired by that. And if you look at Metallica and that, and even then you go down to the Nirvanas and that, they're all influenced by people like that. So there's even the rave cultures and the dance culture and the two-tone and all these type of things that came out, the new romantics, they all came about because of the way that the punk time ripped up the rule book, and it's influenced music ever since. All that electronic music, the dance music, as I said, that came out of that time as well. You can trace it all back to those particular times, because once again, those people, like the guys in Iron Maiden starting off in the East End of London, they wouldn't have bothered if it hadn't been shown to them that they could do it in the past. Gave them a chance as well, and spiced things up and changed things around a little bit, made things a little bit spikier, maybe a bit more interesting. I will leave it there. Thanks very much. Goodbye.